Hey guys, I'm Taufik. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can solve real-world SQL interview questions on LeetCode. Now, LeetCode is a platform where you would find hundreds and thousands of different programming questions which you can solve either by using Java, JavaScript, Python, C++, Ruby, PHP, and so many other programming languages. Now, LeetCode also has questions related to SQL, and these questions on SQL can be solved by using either Oracle, MySQL, or Microsoft SQL Server. In this video, I'm going to solve 3 SQL questions so you get an idea of how to find SQL questions on LeetCode and then how to go about solving them. Now, in order to use LeetCode, you will need to create a free account with LeetCode. So when you create a free account with LeetCode, you only get access to the free programming questions that are available on LeetCode. For example, in SQL, as of today, I see that LeetCode has around 200 questions on SQL, but out of these 200, I think only 20 questions are free. So by creating a free account, you only have access to these 20 free SQL questions. But I think if you're starting to learn SQL, then these free questions should be sufficient to get an understanding of how to go about solving these questions. Now, I have already solved all the free SQL questions on LeetCode. So what I'll be doing is all the queries that I have used to solve these questions, I'll post it on my blog. So what I would recommend is you try to solve these questions on LeetCode on your own. But let's say if you're stuck and if you're not sure how to proceed, then you can definitely refer to my queries that I will be pasting on my blog. Now, if you're new to SQL and if you're trying to learn SQL, then I would highly recommend that you use LeetCode to practice SQL queries and solve all the free SQL questions. Now, the main reason for that is the questions that are framed on LeetCode are pretty similar to how you would be asked SQL questions on an interview. So, if you're preparing for interview, then LeetCode can really be a very good place to practice and solve SQL questions. Now, before I can start writing queries, if you like my work and if you'd like to support this channel, then please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give me a thumbs up. Thank you, and let's begin. Okay, so in order to use LeetCode, the very first thing that you need to do is you need to go to your browser and type leetcode.com. Now this should take you to the LeetCode website. And here, if you have not created an account, then you will need to click on this create account and create an account. Now it's pretty straightforward. You just need to provide your name, your password, and an email ID. So if you have not created, then go ahead and create this account. I have already created a LeetCode account, so I'll just click sign in and then log into my account. When you log into LeetCode, this is basically how your LeetCode account would look like. Now, this is basically the home page, but what we are interested in is solving the programming questions. So for that, if you see on the top here, you would have some tabs, and there is a tab like problems. So just click on problems, and this is basically the page where you can solve the programming questions. Okay. Now, if you have already solved some programming questions, then you would see a summary here, how many programming questions you have solved. Now, each of these questions have a difficulty level of easy, medium, and hard. And this would basically show you how many easy, how many medium, and how many hard questions you have solved. Okay, so we are only interested in solving the SQL questions in this video. So in order to find the SQL questions, we can just click on this filter here like database. Okay, so I think this is newly added. Previously, we did not have an option like database. We had to specifically search SQL to find all the SQL questions, but now it becomes much easier to find SQL questions. So just choose database and you would see all the database related questions. Basically, this means these are all the SQL related questions. Now, if I go down, you would see that I have 50 questions in each page and there are 4 pages. So I'm assuming that there are around 200 questions. And you can see that most of these questions here, we have this something like a locked symbol or we have this premium. So means that these questions are not free. If you want to solve these questions, you will need to purchase the premium subscription, which costs around $35 per month. But if you're new and if you're learning SQL from scratch, then I would recommend that you first try to solve all the free questions and only then consider purchasing the premium subscription. Okay, so the very first question that we will be solving in this video is going to be this one, that is 197, which is the rising temperature. So I'll just click on that and open it in a new tab. And let me just zoom this so you can see it better. Okay, so now you can see that the question name is rising temperature. It has a unique ID 197 and it belongs to the easy difficult level. Now, since this is an SQL question, you can solve this question either by using any one of these databases. So we have MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, or Oracle. Okay, so I'll just try to solve this question in the beginning in Oracle. I'll also provide you the solution in MySQL and Microsoft SQL Server as well. So just let's first try to understand this question before we start writing the query. Okay, so we can see that there is a table by the name weather, and this table structure is provided here. So we have this column name. So we have ID, record date, and temperature. Its data type is mentioned here, and some description about the table is given here, saying that ID is the primary key for this table, and this table contains information about temperature on a certain day. Okay, so we understand what the data in this table is going to have. Okay, so next let's see the query. So we are asked to write a query to find all dates ID with higher temperature compared to its previous dates or yesterday. Okay, so what this means is we need to find the IDs of a particular day when the temperature was higher than the temperature of the previous day. Okay, so we need to write a query for that. First, let's look at the data in this table and try to understand what we need. So they generally for every question you would generally see what is the input data, and they will also show you the output. Let's look at the input data first. So we have this weather table, we have this ID, and we have 4 records here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have the dates. So it's 1st Jan 2015, 2nd Jan 2015, 3rd Jan, and 4th Jan, and then we have the temperature. Now from this question, what I can understand is when I process the first record, I basically for every record I need to compare its temperature with the temperature of the previous day. Now since this is the first record, there would basically be no previous day, because the previous day would be for this, that is the 1st Jan 2015, the previous day would be 31st December 2014, and we do not have data for that. So basically this first record should not be part of our output. But when I process the second record, you can see that 2nd Jan 2015 the temperature is 25 and the previous day temperature is 10. So this is higher than the previous day temperature, and that means the second record should be part of our output. Okay, so that's one thing. Now when I move to the third record, I can see that 3rd Jan has having temperature as 20, but the previous day temperature was 25. So this is actually 20 is not greater than 25. So record number 3 should not be part of our output. And similarly, when I go to record number 4, I can see that 4th Jan 2015 is having temperature as 30, and the previous day temperature was 20. So 30 is greater than 20. So that means my record number 4 should be part of my output. Okay, and if I just go down, you would see the sample output. So they've already provided you what is the expected output, and they're saying the expected output is 2 and 4, because as per the query they asked us to write the dates ID. Okay, we should not be fetching the dates but the ID of those dates. So we know that record number 2 and record number 4 is what will satisfy the given condition, and that is what should be in our output. Okay, so we basically need to write a query to return 2 and 4 for this data. But then the query should not just work for this data, the query should work for generically for any type of data. Okay, and I'll explain that a little later. So let's now try to write this query. Okay, so whenever you have this kind of requirement where you need to compare the data of a particular table to itself, then using a self join should be one of your best options. I'm not saying that you can solve this question only by using self join. Of course, you can solve it by other method as well. But whenever we compare data from one table to itself, then using a self join is definitely one of the best options. So we'll try to solve this query just by using self join. Okay, so we know that the column that we are required to fetch is ID. So I'll just do select ID because our output should only have one column, that is ID, and then we need to use the table that we need to fetch the data from. So I know that table is weather, but since I need to compare the data, that is compare each day, basically the current day with the previous day, that means I need to compare the data from this same table to itself. I will need to use a self join. So I'll just use the same table twice. So I'll say first table as W1. So I'm going to join this table again to itself, and this time I'm going to call this like, let's say W2. Okay, so this is basically how I'm doing a self join. That is, you basically join the same table to itself, but you definitely have to give different aliases. Okay, so kind of Oracle treats this like two different tables even though they are the same table. Okay, and then we need to do the join. So let's see what the join condition should be. But before that, just for better understanding, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a comment here saying that let's imagine that this W1 is going to be our previous day, and then this W2 is going to be our current day. Okay, and our requirement is that we need to compare the temperature of the current day with the previous day, and only if the temperature is greater we need to fetch that record. Correct? So before comparing the temperature, let's try to find, or basically try to match the current day with previous day. Okay, and I know that the column that we need to compare is this one, that is the record date. So how do I join this? So I always know that the current day will always be one day greater than the previous day, correct? So I can just add a condition like that. So I can say w2 dot record date minus 1. So whenever I subtract one day from the current day, I should get the previous day. So I can just say w1 dot record day. Okay, so basically my previous day will always be one day less than the current day, and that is the condition that I have added here. Okay, and then the next condition that I need to put is based on temperature. So I know that my current day is w2, so I just need to say w2 dot temperature is greater than w1 dot temperature. Okay, so basically just these two checks here. I'm first defining that w2 will be my current day table and w1 is going to be my previous day. This is just for my understanding, and then I'm adding the condition with that understanding, saying that if I do the current day minus one day, it's going to be equal to the previous day, and then I'm checking that the current day temperature should be greater than the previous day temperature. Okay, so this is fine. And one last thing is, in my select clause, I need to choose this ID from which table. I know that I need to fetch the data where the temperature of the current day is greater than the previous day. So basically I need to fetch the ID of the data for the current day. So I'll just say w2.id. Okay, and I think this query should work. So let me try to run this. So when you run this query, what LeetCode basically does is, for the example that they have given, for this data, they will try to run this query and check if the query works. And in this case, it's telling accepted. And so basically the query worked. Okay. And you can also see the input that they have used and the output that this query has fetched and what was the expected output. So in this case it matches, so they say accepted. And when I do submit, so if I have to record this solution, then I need to click on submit. So only when I do submit, it gets saved by LeetCode. Okay, so when I do submit, what LeetCode basically does is it tries to run this query not just for one particular data, but also for many other example data that they have internally stored. We cannot see that data set until unless we see some error, but basically they will try to run this query for many other data set as well. And if it tells success, that means that generically this query would work for any kind of data. Okay, and here we have got success. It will also tell you how much time your query took and how faster it was compared to other solutions that have been returned by other users. Okay, so basically we have solved these questions, and I have used Oracle to solve this question. So this is basically the description tab that we basically saw the query. And the submission, when we did the submit, it will take us to this tab submission, where you would see your success. I've already solved these queries as I told you, and that is why you would see multiple exceptions, accepted things. And then if you click on solution, you would basically see what is a solution that LeetCode has suggested, and you would also see some other comments, some suggestions that are given by some other users. And also there is a discussion tab where you would find some other solutions and some discussions as well. If you want, you can refer to that as well. Okay, so now if I go back to description, now there's one thing that I want to tell here. Since I have used Oracle, in Oracle, if I want to find the previous day or subtract or add a day to a date column, I can just do -1 or +1. Okay, but if I try to run the same query in MySQL, let's say I want to run the same query in MySQL, it's not going to actually work, because in MySQL, we cannot subtract a day from the date just by doing -1. Okay, we will need to use some functions. So as I told you in my previous video, the SQL syntax and most of the formatting would be same across all the RDBMS, but there might be some functions which may be specific to each RDBMS. So let's try to use a function for MySQL. So the concept and the logic, everything is the same, just that we need to subtract a day from this W2 record date, and we cannot just do -1, so we will need to use a function. Okay, and the function that I'm going to be using is going to be date_sub, and date_sub will accept two parameters. So the first parameter is the date itself, and the second parameter will be interval 1 day. Okay, now this interval is basically a keyword that you need to use, and then you need to specify what you need to basically subtract. So I need to subtract 1 day, so I mentioned day. If I wanted to subtract a month, I can mention month, and so on. Okay, and I'm saying 1. So basically this stands for date subtract, so it will subtract 1 day from this record date. Okay, and now if I try to run this, so I have not changed anything else except for this function here. So you can see it's accepted in MySQL as well. And if I click submit, Hopefully it should work, and you can see that it's working, and it will tell you how faster this solution was. Okay, so this is fine. Now let's try to solve this query by using Microsoft SQL Server. So again, in Microsoft SQL Server, we do not have date underscore sub function as far as I know. So we will need to use some other function to subtract a day from this date. Okay, and the function that I'm going to be using is date add. Now date add will again accept a few parameters. The first parameter that it is going to accept is day, so because we need to subtract a day, and then I am going to say -1 because this basically by default will add a day. If I want to subtract a day, then I need to specify -1. Okay, and then the third argument would be the date itself, that is my w2.record date. Okay, so I'm just using this function in Microsoft SQL Server, and everything else is the same. Okay, so now let me try to run this query, and it's accepted. So let me submit it. So always remember, don't just run the code, but you also need to submit it. Only then it gets saved and recorded by LeetCode. So I have submitted and it is fine. It's working fine. Okay, so basically this is how we have solved the question number 197 in all the three RDBMS. Okay, and you would find the solution to all of this in my blog. So I'll leave a link to my blog in the description below. Okay, so I hope this was simple and understandable. Now let's try to solve some slightly complex queries. So let's move on to the next question. Okay, so I'll just close this, and the next question we'll try to solve is 262, that is trips and users, and you can see that this is a hard question. Now what I have noticed is in LeetCode, even the hard questions are not that hard, but this one, there is a slight complexity to it. We'll try to solve it. So this question name is basically trips and users. It's a hard question. Its ID is 262, and we can solve it in any of this RDBMS. So I'll try to first solve it in Oracle and then provide you the solution in the other RDBMS as well. So let's first try to read this question. And maybe I'll just move this to the right because I think this question is a little too lengthy. So let's carefully try to read this question. So we have a table trips, and it has this many columns. So we have ID, client ID, driver ID, city ID, status, and request at. Now ID is a primary key for this table, and this table holds all taxi trips. Each trip has a unique ID, while client ID and driver ID are foreign keys to the users table and to the column users ID at the users table. Okay, so meaning that we have another table called users, which has three columns: users ID, band, and role. Now there is a foreign key constraint here, that is client ID and driver ID are foreign key to this users ID column from the users table. Okay, and then going back to the trips table, we have another column here, status, which basically is an enum type, meaning that this column can only have any one of these three columns. So the trip can either be completed, cancelled by driver, or it can be cancelled by client. Okay, so this is basically how the data in trips table is going to look like. And then coming to the users table, we have three columns: users ID, band, and role. Users ID is basically primary key for this table, so this is a primary key, and the table holds all users. Each user has a unique user ID, and the role is a enum type, meaning that the role column can either have driver, partner, or client. So meaning that this users ID can either be the ID of the driver, it can be the ID of the client, or it can be the ID of the partner. Okay, so and then we have this band column, which is again an enum type, which can either be yes or no. Okay, so meaning that there can be some users who may be banned, so they will have the value as yes, and if a user is not banned, then it will have the value as no. So this is basically how the table structure looks like. So it's always important to understand what the table structure is and how the data is stored in this table before we start writing our query. Okay, and next let's try to understand a few other things. So here they have given some more explanation. So they are telling the cancellation rate. So basically the trip cancellation rate is computed by dividing the number of cancelled requests, okay, so either by client or driver, with the unbanned users by the total number of requests by the unbanned users. Okay, so meaning that if you want to find the cancellation rate for a particular day, then we just need to divide the number of cancelled trips divided by the total number of trips. Okay, and when doing that, we need to consider that the users are either by client or driver, and those users are unbanned. Okay, so you will understand this further when I try to solve this query, but just remember this is the formula that LeetCode has already provided to find the cancellation rate. Now why this is important is because the query that they have asked us to write is write a SQL query to find the cancellation rate of request with unbanned users for both client and driver must not be banned for each day between these two dates, that is 1st October 2013 to 3rd October 2013, and round the cancellation rate to 2 decimal points. Okay, and you can return the result in any order. So meaning that we don't need to specify any order when we finally write this query. Okay, now this query has a few things that we need to consider. First thing is we need to write a query to find the cancellation rate. That is clear, but we need to find the cancellation rate for each day. Okay, and only for the days which are mentioned here, only for these 3 days, so 1st October to 3rd October. So find the cancellation rate for each day, but only for these 3 days. Okay, and the cancellation rate, whatever we get, we need to round it to 2 decimal points. And one more thing is cancellation rate should be for unbanned users only, and we should consider both client and drivers. Okay, so there is a lot of conditions that we need to satisfy before we finally find the cancellation rate. Okay, so now let's look at the data in this table. So first let's look at the trips table. We have this trips table, we have ID, client ID, driver ID, city, status, and requested. And just by looking at this data, we can see that we have some trip. This is by client 1 and he was taken to this trip by this driver 10 and he has the status as completed. So this trip was completed. Then we have the second client and from the driver 11, and this trip was cancelled by driver. Similarly, we have some trips which are cancelled by client and many of the trips are completed, and we have the dates when this trip was held. Okay, and then we have information about the users. So this users table will have information not just about the client but also about the driver as well. So just by looking at this, I can see that the client 2 here is actually a banned client. So you can see that out of all this users data that is mentioned here, there is only one record where the client is banned. So meaning that if the banned equal to yes, that means this client is banned. So that's one thing to remember. Now, if I go down, you would see the expected output. So they are telling that for each day, we need to find a cancellation rate, and we are only expected to return the output for these 3 dates. Okay. So let's do one thing. We'll try to split this query into multiple different parts. So whenever you're trying to write a query where there are too many things to do, it's always a good practice to split the query into multiple parts. So you try to write a query for each part and then try to sum them together, okay, or bring them together. So what's the first thing that we need to do? We need to first do, let's just write it out just so it becomes easier. Trim the trips table to have required data. This is the first thing. Once we have the required data, then try to get the total requests per day. Okay, this is the second thing. And then once we have that, then get the cancelled request per day. Okay, so this is basically the 3 steps that we need to do. So since each of this step we would have to create a subquery, instead of using multiple subqueries in my query, I'll just use the with clause. So let's go ahead and write this query. So I'm going to use a with clause. So first thing is we need to trim the data from trips table to get our required data. So let's call this with an alias like data. I'm going to say as, and here I'll just write my query. So I know that I need to fetch my data from the trips table. I'm going to give an alias as trips. And if I just go here, I can see this table has, okay, ID, client ID, but the data I need is, one is this column, that is request at, okay, and then I need the status column, okay, because we need to find the cancelled request. So only the status, by the status column we can identify if a trip was cancelled or not. Okay, and then we also need the driver ID and city, but we basically need this to filter the data. Okay, so the columns that we would need is only these two. We are not going to be using ID, or we are not going to be using city ID. Okay, and client ID and driver ID we will use, but we don't need it in the select clause, and you will come to know why. Now, okay, so we are fetching these 2 columns from this table. Now let's try to add our filter condition. So let's add the most basic filter condition first. That is the date. So we need to fetch the data only for 3 particular date, right? So it's given here from between 1st October to 3rd October. So let's try to do that. So I'm just going to say where t dot, and this is my column, request at between. So I need to specify the 2 dates. Now, since it's going to be a hard-coded date, I'm just going to convert this varchar into a date. So I'm going to use the function toDate. So I'll just copy this date here. So I'll say this one. Okay. And okay, just to make it more neat. Okay, so I'll just move this right between this toDate. I need to also specify the date format. So my date format will be YYYY -mm-dd, and then I need to say and between this, and let me just copy this whole thing again and I'll paste it here. So this will be for 3rd October, right? Okay, so this basically is fine, but whenever I'm trying to specify or whenever I'm trying to compare a date column with some hard-coded date column, it's always a good practice that we'll use the same date format for that column as well. So I'll just use toDate and then I'll specify the format. So that will be YYYY-MM-DD. Okay, so that's fine. Okay, so I think this filter condition is fine. So we have filtered the data for these 3 dates only. Now we also need to add some other filter condition as well, so that we make sure that we fetch the data only for the unbanned users. Okay, so how do we do that? So if I just look at the data here, I know that I have the users here. I have both client ID and driver ID, and I need to do this check for both these columns. And in order to find if the client ID is banned or not, I just need to check in the users table, right? So whenever you have this kind of requirement, the best thing to do is to use a exist statement. You can also use in or not in, or you can use a subquery as well, but I think exist is slightly better. I'll just use a where clause here, and I'm going to say exist, and inside here I'm going to be using my users table. So I'll say select one from users, and I'm going to give an alias like u, where I need to join users with trips. So I'm just going to say, okay, but before that I need to fetch only the unbanned user. So I'm just going to say u.banned equal to no. So let me just move this to the next line. And here I also need to join the users table with the trips table. So I can just say u.users underscore ID equal to t dot. Okay, let's first try to compare it with the client ID. Okay, so what basically I have done in this exist statement is, okay, and here I need to change it to and. Okay, so let me just explain you this exist statement. What I'm doing is, for every record in this trips table, that is for every trip, I am checking if the client ID is present in the users table where the band is no. So I'm basically checking if the client is not banned. Okay, so this is basically how I'm doing this check. Now, since I have done this check for client, I also need to do this check for driver as well. So I'm just going to copy the same check and I'm going to paste it here. This time, instead of using client ID, I'm just going to be using the driver ID. Okay, so I have written the first part of my query, that is I have trimmed the data from the trips table such that it only is going to hold the data that I need to write this query. Okay, now the second part of this query is to find the total request. So let me first write the structure of how this query should look like. Okay, so my second part should be total request. This is my second temp table inside with clause total request as, and here I need to write my query, and I also need to find the total cancels, and I'll write as, and here I need to write my subquery, and then finally I need to write my main query by using the select, and I need to find some columns, and then I need to do a from clause where I need to join the total request with the total cancels, and then I just need to divide the total cancels divided by total requests, which should basically give me my final output. Okay, so I'm going to write this part of the query later on, and I just showed this how the final query should look like, and we are going to write the total cancels also later on. So let's just move it a little down. Now let's just focus on writing the total request query. Okay, so just by looking at the data, I can say that, so how do I find the total request from this table? So it's pretty straightforward, right? So from this table, we just need to find for each day, what were the total number of trips. Okay, and instead of using the trips table, I should be using the data table, because the data table is trimmed to only have data that I need, right, based on the conditions or the filters that were given to us. Okay, so what I can just do is I can just say select from data, and then I need to do a group by that date column. So I have this column here, request at. So since I'm grouping the data based on request at, I need to fetch that column here, and then I need to count for each day what were the total number of records. I can just do a count of 1, and I'm going to give an alias to this, like let's say number of request. So I think this should basically work. So from this trimmed trips table, or the data table that I'm calling this now, I'm just grouping all the records for each day and then counting total number of records for each day. This should basically return me the total number of requests, and I think this should be fine. Okay, so now since we have the total request already given here, let's try to write the query to find the total number of cancelled requests. Now to find the total number of cancelled requests, I can basically copy the exact same thing with just one additional filter condition. So what is the total number of cancelled requests? So if I just go back to trips table, total number of requests, so let's say for, okay, so let's consider this for this for the 1st October, total number of requests would be 4. But then I need to not consider the banned user. So 2 is a banned user. So basically this record I should not be considering. So I should only considering this and this and this. So for the 1st October 2013, these are the 3 total requests. But how do I find a total cancelled request? That is just by using this column status. So in the status, I know that if it is completed, that means the trip was successful. But if it is like cancelled by driver or cancelled by client, that means these were the cancelled trips. So we just need to count that. Okay. So by the query that we have already written here, we have already counting the total number of records for each day, but here I just need to put another filter condition saying that where status in those 2 cancelled states. So let me just copy that. So let me just move here. So that is cancelled by driver. So let me just move this here. Okay, and I'll say cancelled by driver, and then I have this cancelled by client. So let me move this back here. Okay. So I'll say cancel by client. Okay. So basically by using this filter condition status, this query should return me only those trips which were cancelled by either driver or client. And then I'm just counting for each day how many number of cancels happened. So I'll just change this name to, let's say, number of cancels. Okay. So basically this should be our query. So what we have done is we have split this query into 3 parts. First, we trim the real actual data to fetch only for the required data that we need. Then I found a total number of requests. Then I found a total number of cancelled requests. Now we need to join the total request with total cancels. So when I'm doing a join, there's one thing that we need to remember, and that is there can be days where there were no cancellations at all. So let's say there was a day where there was no cancellation at all. Then what would happen is this data here would not fetch any record. Okay. So for example, if I just look at the data, I can see that for this one, so for the 2nd October 2013, I can see that all the trips were completed. So there are basically no cancelled requests. So in this case, this query, what would happen is this query would not fetch any record. Okay, if this query would not fetch any record, and if I'm trying to do an inner join with the total request, then my whole query would not return any record. So that is what I need to handle, and that is where I need to use instead of inner join. So when I say join, this basically means inner join. Okay, so instead of using inner join, I just need to use a left join. So what happens is it's going to fetch the data even if this total cancels is not having any record. So since on 2nd October 2013, there were no cancellations, so this would not fetch any record, but total request was still having some record because there were 3 trips. So this query would still return us some data. Okay, and that is why I'm using a left join here. Now let's try to join these 2 tables. So how do I join? The most common column here is basically requested. So we just need to join based on that. So okay, first let me give an alias to this. I'm going to call this like tr, and then I'm going to call this like tc, and let me just join this. So tr.requested equal to tc.requested. Okay, so I think we have done the most part of this query. Now we just need to do the final part, that is to calculate the cancellation rate. Okay, so if I just look at the output here, they are asking me to fetch, what's the output? So we need to fetch day and cancellation rate. So let me just copy this cancellation rate here, and then we need day. So one thing to remember in LeetCode is that when you provide your output query, the columns that they are expecting, we need to specify the same columns in the same case. Otherwise, sometimes it can throw an error. Okay, so we need day and cancellation rate. So how do I get the day? Day is basically tr.request at, okay, and I'm going to name this like, let's say, day. Okay, and then my second column would be something like cancellation rate. So I'm just going to place this column alias inside the double quotes. So whenever you want to give an alias, and if it has a space, then you always use a double quotes. Okay, so we need to now calculate the cancellation rate. So let me just maybe move this down so we can just write the cancellation rate. So what is the cancellation rate? So cancellation rate is just basically total number of cancels divided by total requests. So I can just say number of cancels, that is let's say, okay, I'm just going to move this down just so you can see it more clearly. So I just need to do tc dot total number of cancels divided by tr dot total number of requests, right? So if I just do this, it should provide me my cancellation rate. But there is one tricky part here, and that is the total number of cancels can sometimes be null, because for 2nd October 2013 this would not fetch any record. So basically this total number of cancels would be null. So we cannot just divide null by some integer. So we need to handle this null value. So how we can handle this is, I'm just going to use a function coalesce. So I'm just going to say coalesce of this value. If it is null, then return me 0. Okay, so if it is null, I'll return it 0. So 0 divided by some number will still work. That's the first thing. And then last thing is, if you just look at the query here, we were told that we need to provide the cancellation rate, round the cancellation rate to 2 decimal points. So we need to round our output. So in order to round our output to 2 decimal points, and since I'm using Oracle, I can just use the function round. So this whole thing here, and I'm just going to say to 2 decimal points. Okay, so I think this basically should work. And okay, so let me try to run this query. So let me just open this, and I think, okay, so I think we are all set. So let me just remove the spaces here. Even if there are spaces, it's not going to throw an error, but I'm just removing the spaces just to make it a little short. And let me now run this. Let's see if it works. Okay, so it has worked and it's accepted. Now let's try to submit it. So when we submit it, it's going to check for many other example data as well. So let's see if this query works for everything. And you can see that it's returned success. So this query has worked. Okay, so basically this is how we have solved this query using Oracle. Now let's try to do one thing. Let's try to solve this query for MySQL and Microsoft SQL Server as well. So as I told you, the query would be exactly the same, but some functions may not work in some other RDBMS. So if I just keep it here. Okay, so let me just minimize this. How do I minimize this? Okay, here. So the thing that would not work in MySQL is this one, that is this function toDate. So in MySQL, when we want to do a date format, we do not use toDate. toDate is specific to Oracle. In MySQL, I don't think we have toDate, but instead of toDate, we have something like date format. So I can just use date format, and I cannot use this format that is YYMMDD, but I can use the format like capital Y, that is percentage capital Y, then dash, then percentage M for month, and then percentage D for date. Okay, so I'll just try to copy this for in all this date format. So I'll just copy this format as well. So I'll paste it here. And I think this should be the only change that we need to do between Oracle and MySQL. So the whole logic, the whole syntax of this SQL, everything should work. Even coalesce and round works exactly the same how it works in Oracle. Okay, so let's try to run this query now. And it's accepted. So let me now try to submit it. And let's just see here if it's success. So it is success. Okay, so this is basically how we can do it in MySQL. Now I'm not going to show you the same version of this in Microsoft SQL Server, but you will find the query, the corresponding query in my blog. So have a look at that. Most of them is the same, but again, we cannot use date format. There will be some other function that we can use. And also there will be some changes to this round, because the round in MySQL and Oracle, it does not work the same in Microsoft SQL Server. So just these functions I would have changed, but other than that, the query logic and the formatting, everything is the same. Okay, so without wasting any more time, let's move on to the next question. Okay, so let me just close this and go to the next question. So the next question that we are going to be solving is going to be in page number 2, and it's going to be 1179, that is reformat department table. Okay, so let me just go here. And let me just move this to the right. Okay, so the question name here is reformat department table. It's 1179 question number, and they have mapped it like easy. And maybe I would have rated this as medium, considering how the questions are rated on LeetCode. Okay, because it's actually easy, but we need to use a special function to solve this particular query. Okay, so here let's try to understand this question. So we have this table as department. It has 3 columns: ID, revenue, and month. And then it's telling ID and month is the primary key for this table. And then the table has information about revenue of each department per month. Okay, and the month can be either of these, that is a 12 months that we are aware of. Okay, now they are telling write a SQL query to reformat the table such that there is a department ID column and a revenue column for each month. Okay, so okay, they are So basically they're asking us to reformat this table. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. So they're saying that the current table is like this. So we have the department table, we have the ID column, we have the revenue and the month. So the revenue for each month corresponding to each department is represented in a particular row. Okay, so you would see that for department 1 we have 3 records here, so 1, 2 and 3, and this is data for 3 different months, so Jan, Feb and March. But what they are saying is we need to convert this data into something like this. So we need to have one column for ID, that is a department ID, and then we need to have one column for each month. Okay, so for all the Jan revenue will be in this column, all the February revenue in this column, all the March revenue in this column, and so on and so forth. So there will be 12 columns for each month and there will be one column for department. So the current table has only 3 columns. So we need to convert this data from column level, basically from row level, into column level. So whenever you have this kind of requirement where you need to transpose the data from row to column level, then the best function to be used is going to be pivot. Okay, now the thing is we have this pivot table in Oracle, we have it in Microsoft SQL Server, we also have it in PostgreSQL Server, but it's called, we need to use crosstab function. But when it comes to MySQL, as far as I know, we do not have pivot function. So, but let's say if any of you guys know of some function that can be used similar to pivot in MySQL, then leave a comment below. I would really like to know that. Okay, so we'll try to solve this question in Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server using the pivot table. But when it comes to MySQL, we'll try to solve this question just by using case statement. Of course, we can use case statement to solve this question in Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server as well. But whenever you have pivot, the best way to transpose data from row to column or vice versa is just by using pivot or unpivot. Okay, so we'll just try to use pivot in Oracle and then try to use case statement in MySQL. So let me try to solve this question first in Oracle. Okay, so let's try to write this query. Now, whenever you're using a pivot table, there is a particular way you need to write your query. It's not going to be as normal as how you would write your other queries. So there's a slight difference of writing a query when you're using pivot, and let's see how that format would look like. So generally what you do is we say select star from, okay, and then after that we basically specify the query, that is our base query. This will basically be your query or your table data, basically what you need to do your transpose, and then you specify the pivot function. So you just say pivot, and then after that you just specify some query that is specific to pivot. Okay, so I am just going to call this, like, let's say pivot query. Okay, I don't think so this is actually called as a pivot query. I'm just naming it just for better understanding. Okay, so whenever you're using pivot, this is basically how your query would look like, and I'm using Oracle. Okay, so let's try to solve this one by one. So first, what is our base query? I know that all my data is coming from the department table, and the columns that I need is, I need ID because that's going to be part of my output, and then I need revenue because I need to count or sum together all the revenue for each month. So I need month as well, okay, because the value in the month is actually going to be transposed into each column. Okay, so we need those 3 columns. I'm just going to write the query for that. So I'm just going to say select ID, and then what is that, revenue, and then finally month from department table, right? So this is basically my base query. I don't need to specify any group by or any aggregate functions to basically sum together the revenue. Everything will be taken care by pivot. Okay, so here you just specify your base query, and then this is where we will do our aggregation and the transpose. Okay, so for this, first, the one thing that we need to remember is that now there can be data in this table where for that particular department ID and for that same month you would have 2 records. So here we have first for department ID 1 for the month Jan we have 8,000, but there can also happen that we would have another record where for department 1 for the month Jan we would have some other data saying, let's say 10,000. So in that case we would have to sum together 10 and 8 together 18,000 for this particular department for this particular month. Okay, so this kind of requirement is what we would have. So in that case what we need to do is we need to use an aggregate function called as sum, and we need to sum the revenue together for each month. So I'm just going to use an aggregate function. So whenever you are writing a pivot query here, the first thing is you specify what is the aggregate function that you are going to use. In this case I just need to sum the revenue for each month, so I'm just going to specify sum of revenue. The next thing is to use a for clause, and inside for clause I need to specify which column, or basically from which column I'm going to transpose into multiple different columns. So for month in, here is where I mention all the different months. So I say Jan, then I say Feb, then I say all the different months. Why? Because I know that this is the column month where I have all these different columns, and it is specified here saying that the month has values like all these 12 values. So what I'll just do is I'll just copy this whole thing here. So instead of typing everything, I'll just copy this here. So I know that month has all these values. So let me just move this to the right. Now I have these 12 columns here. I think, yeah, this is my pivot function. So one additional thing that I will need to do here is that if I run this query just like this, then what would happen is it would create these 12 columns, and it would also have the ID column, but these 12 columns would have this column name, that is Jan, Feb, March. But if I look at my requirement from this query, I can see that my output, they are expecting the column to be Jan revenue, Feb revenue, March revenue, something like this. So let me just copy this and let me just change the column name to what is required. So I'll say Jan as this one, and then I'll say Feb as, okay, that will be Feb revenue. So I'll just write this for every single month. Okay, so I have written every single month and have given alias as that is expected in the output. So I hope this should be fine. So 12 months and 12 different alias. And let me try to run this query. Let's see if it works. And okay, so let's try to run this. Okay, so I'm getting some error. Let's try to fix that. Okay, I think this double quotes mostly does not work. We should be using single quotes. So I'm not sure if it is some requirement from Oracle or if it's from LeetCode, but let me just try to make this a single quotes and then try to run it again. So let me just change it. Okay, so let me now try to run this. Let's see if this one works. So the only thing I changed was from double quotes to single quotes. Okay, so I think this worked. Now let me try to submit it. Let's see if this query would work generically for any sort of data. Okay, so this is successful. So that means this query worked. Now that's fine. So we have written this query and this will work exactly fine in Oracle, and in Microsoft SQL Server also it would almost be the same, but some formatting would be different. We would not use the alias here, but we would give it in select clause. But I'll not be doing the Microsoft SQL Server query here, but I will paste the my solution in my blog so you can refer to that. But let's try to solve this query in MySQL, okay? Because we cannot use pivot, so we will need to use a case statement. So let's try to solve this query. We know that I need to do a select from the department table, and I need to fetch the ID column because my data should be grouped together based on ID, because for each ID I need to sum the revenue for each month, right? So since I need to group the data based on ID, I need to do a group by, saying that group by ID. So this is basically going to be my most basic query. But after this is where I need to specify all the different columns for each month. So for each month I need to have one column. So that one I'm going to specify by using the case statement. So I'm just going to say case when. Okay, so let's just look at here. So I think we have the column is, yeah, month. So when I say case when month equal to Jan, okay, then I need to fetch the revenue. Okay, and let's say if the month is not Jan, then I need to maybe provide like null. Okay, and I'll end my case, and I'm going to call this like, let's say Jan underscore revenue. Okay, so this is basically it. Whenever the record in this table is having the month as Jan, I fetch its revenue, and then I will name that column as Jan revenue. But let's say if the data belongs to some other month, that is this third record here, then this would return null. So Jan would be null, but we would write another case statement for Feb, which would have the revenue value. Okay, now that is fine. But as I told you, for a particular department, for the same month, we may have multiple records. So we need to sum together the revenue. You would not see that in this data, but we would need to write our query generically to work for any type of data. So that is why we will need to use a sum here. Okay, and we are also doing a group by ID, so we cannot just specify ID column here and then specify any other column here. So if you're specifying any other column, then it has to be within an aggregate function. So the aggregate function that we are going to be using is sum. So I'll just do one thing. The whole case statement, I will place it inside the sum aggregate function. Okay, and I'm going to call the whole column as Jan revenue. Okay, so this should hopefully work, and this should hopefully work for the Jan column. Now similarly, we'll do this for all the other months. Okay, so I have 1 2 3 4 5 6, and I'll just copy this whole thing again, and I'll paste it. So 12 columns for 12 months. Okay, so let me just minimize this, and now let me just change each of this month and column values to its specific month. Okay, so I have done that. Now let me try to run this query. So let me just move this here and let me run this query. Let's see if this works. I'm using MySQL. Okay, so this is accepted. Now let me try to submit it. Okay, so this one has worked as well. So this is basically how we can solve this query using MySQL. Yes, that's all for this video. If you like this video, then please make sure to subscribe to the channel and give me a thumbs up. And also let me know if you would like me to solve the premium questions on LeetCode related to SQL or Python. Okay, so thank you and see you soon in the next one. Bye.